Good morning, good afternoon, depending on where you are, and welcome to the session we're going to do today on customers, people, and sustainability. I'm Mark Curtis, and I lead innovation and thought leadership at Accenture Interactive, and we're very focused right now on understanding the human and their role in sustainability. Now, when I started thinking about what we were going to do today, I wanted to bring Glaswegians into the hall. The conversation with security took about half a second before I realized that wasn't going to happen. But we've done the next best thing. We've been out and we've done a deep ethnographic study of Glaswegians, 21 of them. That's deep enough for ethnographic purposes. We've done a deep ethnographic study to try and understand how people here in the city which we're holding COP26 in, how they think about sustainability. And we're going to be showing some videos as I talk, and I'm going to be talking about what we discovered when we talked to them. Because the risk with COP26, and I think the risk of a lot of our conversations, is we get very technocratic very quickly. We talk about carbon reduction, and quite rightly too, because that's clearly, number one on the agenda. We talk about how can we do green technology. We talk about how can we have a responsible value chain. Of course, all of these things are really important. But at the end of them all, there's a human, or many humans. So we need to bring humans back into this. And that's what I want to do over the next 45 minutes, and then with a panel for the 45 minutes after that. So, we're going to start with some poetry, because I think that's a really good place to start, because only humans write poetry. So can we have the first video, please?
More than 40,000 years ago, men or women splayed their fingers thus, and put their hands to bare rock. They chewed ochre, red ochre, gritted charcoal, and blue with projectile effort that really took it out of them, their living breath. Raw gouts of pigment spattered the living stencil that was each's own living hand, and made their mark. We do not know why they did it, and maybe they did not either, but they knew they must. It was the cold cave wall, and they knew they were up against it. We might have moved on from primitive paintings and cave walls, but we're still up against it. It's too much to expect the lone person, gripping their trolley with the weight of the world on their shoulders, to make all the right decisions. The impact of each good choice is ill-defined. The cognitive load is too heavy, and the cost of not trying is too huge. Corporations have the power to make the intangible tangible. To lighten that load, it's their responsibility. It's their turn.
So I should acknowledge that the poem you heard was by Liz Lochhead. Some people might call her pretty much the national poet of Scotland, so the words are local too. We've got to stop looking for the sustainable customer. That's a key message here. Some of them are out there, but not enough. The problem we've got here is it's all somebody else's job. So a lot of corporations, I know from the conversations I've had with them over the last decade, have been waiting for the consumer to say, right, we're in, now start selling us sustainable stuff. But a lot of consumers have been waiting for organizations to take their turn and actually say, we're going to step forward now. We're kind of waiting for a perfect world where everybody has a Tesla, everybody eats oat milk, everyone goes on holiday just down the road from their house, and if they don't, they do some carbon offsetting as a result of it, where everybody eats plant-based burgers. It's not around the corner. Not near enough, and we're going to talk about why and prove it. Now, I think of these two forces going on. I call them pull versus push. There's the consumer pull, which we believe is weak. It's not as strong as everybody would like it to be if we're concerned about this topic. If the consumer pull is weak, what is happening, and this fortnight is an example of it, is that the push, I think of them as 5 forces. Probably you all have different forces as well, but I'm going to name 5. Which I think are pushing corporations to go there, which are government, Shareholders, we're hearing lots about that every day. Employees, Amazon workers go on strike, not you might have thought because of pay and conditions, but around the environment. Courts, look at how, what happened recently in Holland. And lastly, CEOs' children, which no one mentions, but they're very important. And I've heard it live and direct from several CEOs. My kids are asking me, what are you going to do about this, mummy? So these 5 forces, our belief is, are pushing faster than the pull is coming from consumers. That's a challenge, because that actually creates a gap. So in order to study that gap, we went out and we talked to, as I said, just over 20 Glaswegians over the summer. And there are 4 main messages that I've got for you today. The first is, we need to break the stalemate. And there is this thing called the say-do gap. If you're a consultant, which I am, you might prefer to call this the value-action gap. I think say-do gap is a bit more every day. So this say-do gap is palpably out there. And we can see it when we look at the numbers. These were released actually earlier this year in February. 65% of people globally say, yes, I want purpose-driven brands, but actually only 26% go out of their way to buy from purpose-driven brands or are conscious of it when they're at the point of it or make decisions in favor of those. So you've got this enormous say-do gap going on. And the first reaction to that, obviously my reaction to that when I think about it is, well, organizations need to close the say-do gap. That's their responsibility to begin to do that. Well, actually, it's not exactly as simple as that, is what we really began to find out. I thought about, when we started thinking about this, we thought about behavior change. And we thought about the role that organizations would have in behavior change. And that seemed to lock into place quite quickly as a piece of thinking, that behavior change would be the thing that organizations are going to have to do. And I am going to talk about that quite a bit. But actually, it's not quite as simple as that, because there are nuances around behavior change. So the say-do gap needs this reframe. We're hearing people very concerned all over the world. I think it's 95% in Mexico. It's even the lowest country in the world, Egypt, is 50% of people are saying either I want this to happen or I think it's fairly important. But the reality is that when you go to the point of purchase, for some people it's actually an aspiration do gap, because say is part of the problem. One of the reasons why opinion pollsters have found it so difficult to be accurate over decades now, although I know it is getting better, is because people say one thing about what they're going to do in the voting booth, but then they actually do another, and we've all seen this play out in various countries around the world. It's the same thing when we're talking to them about sustainability. They say one thing, and they might feel like this is the right thing to say, and I have the aspiration to do it. But it's actually worse, because for many people, we think probably the majority, it's sort of vaguely back of mind do gap, rather than the say-do gap. And I want you to bear in mind as I go through it that the Glaswegians we chose for this study had already signaled that they had some interest in sustainability. So we already biased the research because we wanted to talk to people who were thinking about it rather than people who didn't even have an articulation on it. So I think for many people, they're in the vaguely back of mind. And the reason for this is because actually sustainability is not a priority in their everyday lives. And I'm going to talk extensively about that and show some videos which show it. So actually, if we go back, what I'd like to do now is show the next video, which shows us some of the participants in our research in their everyday context. And I think it's really important that we immerse ourselves for a couple of minutes in that texture. So can we have the next video, please?
It's quite like a small industry in Glasgow. Everyone sort of knows everyone, so it's quite easy to get a job in coffee once you've got one.
See you later. Have a good day.
I think we were just at the pub one night and then we just saw each other about all the time and became pals and then ended up being colleagues.
Yeah, it's just Glasgow. It's the drinking man's Las Vegas. Everybody just meets in the pub. We get a big mix. Because we're quite vegan friendly, majority of the people that come in are vegan. They are conscious of the environment. I mean, we just had like one of the best summers we've ever had. And if that's not climate change, I don't know what it is. It was like sunny for like 2 months.
Yeah.
And that doesn't happen.
Well, keep the monkey. Big Marty.
Like it?
Mind me asking what year you were born?
Who, me?
Yeah.
1941. The day they struck the Bismarck. 29th to the 5th, 41.
Pity he wasn't on it sometimes.
Jimmy, what's your hopes for the future?
Get his fish supper on Sunday.
And what do you want for dinner? Come here. Do you want... In my household, there is a Yule, which is 5 months old. I've got a 5-year-old and my husband. Can you sit down for 1 second? There is not enough time in the day to get things done. It's hard, especially with 2 kids. You feel like you're constantly chasing your tail. You tend to kind of like bypass things quite a lot.
Go! Cha-cha-cha-cha. He's a Havanese, which is the national dog of Cuba. I looked at a Bolognese as well, which is from Bologna, but they were just really, they're about that size. I mean, I'm bad enough being this size, taking him out for a walk. Yeah, so in July, I had a bit of a health scare. I took a heart attack in the living room after letting the dog out, giving him his breakfast, and it was all right to all wrong. It was as quick as that. You could have clicked your fingers. I'm the kind of guy you would find quickly checking emails when they're on a holiday, that type of thing. That whole side of things to me that's now stopped.
I just graduated uni this May, and then since then I've been working in hospitality ever since. Most of my money goes on rent, and then food, and then probably going out. You know, maybe I spend money on clothes. I buy like loads of like stuff like online, second-hand. Probably where a lot of it goes as well.
I left school with no real kind of intentions of doing anything, and it was my dad's past that encouraged me to want to work on cars.
Emily, my oldest daughter, was born. I was 19 years old, so still very young myself, very naive. And Sophia came along 2 years later when I was 21. This year's been tough for everyone, coming out of lockdown and stuff like that. I've also had my own hurdles along the way. The passing of my dad earlier on throughout the year, do you know what I mean? So I would say my plate is pretty full, you know, because obviously I've got work commitments. I've got my new house, I've got my 2 children, I've got a child on the way, you know. When people are shocked to see that you're a parent at that age, they're brilliant wee girls though, they keep you going, and I couldn't ask for better children.
So I think one of the first things we need to talk about is that sustainability is a profoundly global and local issue at the same time. We've done similar research in Sweden, and we're seeing actually different things being said there, but the same things as well. So this is important because we saw Hannah and Mark, we saw Jimmy and Linda, we saw Nabila, Stephen, Sean, Blair, and they had one binding sentiment amongst all of them, which is we're doing our best. And I think you'd probably hear that in most countries across the world. So I think that's a global response that you will hear. But it's important because once you get under the texture of their lives, you only see a little bit of it in this, you begin to understand we need to be careful about what we ask people to do. And COVID doesn't make it any easier. So, I mean, I hardly need to labour that point, but it's been a pretty rough couple of years. And we heard stories from them, you know, having to look after elderly relatives, you know, being locked in, et cetera, car mechanic work disappearing, all of that. Because all of that, we come back to this point that consumers are not going to break the stalemate. So that's the first point. The second one, which kind of derives from the first, is the mass market sustainable consumer is a myth. They are not out there. And we actually don't believe, after this research and others that we've done, we don't believe they're going to be out there. I'm talking mass market for some time to come, if ever. The gap is wider than we thought. It's not just about making things more affordable or more convenient. What's going on in people's heads is much richer and much deeper than that, and we need to pay attention to that. So basic decisions are tied, and this is not revelatory psychology, they're tied to what are the priorities for me, myself, what are the priorities for others around me that I care about, and importantly, how do I want to be perceived? So identity is central. Let's have a look at the third video and think about identity while we're watching this.
People say I'm daft for cars. It's all I've kind of really known and had an interest in. I've had this car for 5 or 6 years. It's more of a kind of labour of love. It's a donkey, it will just keep going. You put diesel in it and it runs. My car, which obviously doesn't meet up-to-date Euro emissions standards, but I can't really afford an electric car. I couldn't work in Govan, which is 11 miles from here, and then have to rely on public transport or cycle, you know, when the weather's the way it is in Scotland. My children are the hardest thing because they are so fussy. They like chicken nuggets, they like mince and potatoes, do you know what I mean? So to then come home and try and cook 4 meals for 4 different pallets is not sustainable when you're burning all the gas and you've got all the lights lit, you know?
I think, like, we can all take, like, a bit of personal responsibility for it, but there's only so much that me recycling is going to do. You know, I'm vegetarian, trying to make steps towards vegan, because, like, dairy and meat agriculture is one of the biggest polluters, but that's, like, personal things, and I'm able to do that. Not everyone in the world is able to do that.
Too salty? No, I didn't. The word sustainability didn't really mean much to me, I would say, until quite recently. I remember kind of watching the David Attenborough Planet series on Netflix, and I think that's when it really kind of started to hit home. I think when your child points it out to you, you do think about it a lot more. And then when he comes home and he knows more than you, you definitely want to Google that and find out what's happening. My shopping habits, due to COVID and things like that, have changed so much. And I've just become used to getting things online now, and they just get delivered, and it's just so much more easier.
This is when we do the lining anyway.
I'd love to, at some point, go vegan. I'm not right now.
Well, I eat meat, so I'm a terrible example.
Yeah, absolutely.
It's just so tasty. It's almost like they try and, like, price people out of the market. So it's like, to make yourself feel good, you go like, oh, I'll get a wee vegan thing.
Will I go from cutting out meat and going to some other maybe plant derivative or a vegetarian derivative? I don't really see that happening.
You're filthy.
Certain things you just don't want to get away from. There's nothing better than having a steak on a Thursday night. I suppose you've got to put the right kind of fuel in, and if anything, from what we've discussed and what's happened to me in the last few months, that's important. You walk into Aldi or Morrison's or wherever you might be, and you go to that bit in the fridge where it says, here's your steaks. You don't have the plant-based derivative or the vegetarian derivative next to it, because they're off in another section that I would tend to probably not look at. You maybe look at things and try to buy loose stuff, but then 2 hours later you're on ordering stuff online, and then it comes like just covered in packaging. You've then been driven by convenience, and the whole bit of doing your bit for save the planet is went out the window.
So 3 observations off that. The first I didn't intend to say, but I can't resist it. I showed these films to my niece last night, who lives in Glasgow, and her husband, who's a Glaswegian, and they said, oh, Glaswegians are just so funny. So I don't think we could have chosen a better city to make films like this. The second one, much more importantly, is that did you catch that at least 3 times they were using quite technical terminology, like plant-based derivative from Stephen, and European emission standards from Sean. I think that's interesting. Now, there's a risk, and anybody who's done research will point this out to me rapidly afterwards, there's a risk when you study people, you change them. And probably we did, because they got into the subject while we were talking to them. So, nonetheless, I think it's interesting that they are beginning to use that terminology. The third one, and probably the most important, is the point I hinted at already, which is that if sustainability is at odds with their identity, as it palpably is for Sean, as it palpably is for Stephen, he's a meat eater, then it's really difficult to make it stick. So identity on top of convenience, on top of what can be afforded, becomes really important. And that's why the third main point that I want to land today is that we need to reframe behavior change. Now, our clients, large organizations, already do behavior change. It's something you've been doing for years, for decades. You try and change behavior to get people to prefer your products and services and experiences over your competitors. So you're actually well versed in the issue of behavior change. But this isn't ordinary behavior change because we need to hit the mark obliquely. We can't go and hit it straight on the head because of many of the things that I've been talking about. And when you look, at Sean, what we need to do so that he can feed his children confidently is we need to cross the line where total behavior change is not realistic, but what we're looking for is incremental behavior change. And that leads us on to, I think, 3 golden rules which brands need to think about. The first is you actually don't need to lead with sustainability, and it's very easy to fall into that trap, and we all have to do a lot of stuff. I mean, this is what COP26 is about over the decade to come, less than a decade. But you don't actually, where the customer and consumer is concerned, need to lead with it. For the majority, Sean, Nabila, Stephen, it doesn't need to be explicit as the come on. In fact, it may be counterproductive because you may go to shame, feelings of guilt, and those tend to end up as feelings of annoyance, and that doesn't help anyone. So you need to lead with what matters most, and you probably need to anchor that in the things that they care about and then sell sustainability to them, if you like, as a co-benefit. The second point is sustainability, if it requires sacrifice, is going to be a challenge. Choices can be really hard to reconcile. So you need to ask, what are the sustainable options really asking of people? I conducted a personal experiment about a month ago. I had to go and speak on sustainability in Hamburg at a conference, and I decided to go from where I live in Sussex by train rather than by plane. This involved some sacrifice. So I quantified the whole thing, and it would have taken 1.5 hours, airport terminal to airport terminal, if I had flown. It took 12 hours from St. Pancras International to Hamburg. I learned several things, amongst which German trains do not run on time. That turns out to be a myth. But much more importantly, I had to stay away from home 2 nights. It, don't tell anyone, but cost Accenture more than it should have done because I went by train, even though we think train is a cheaper alternative, and I had to spend 2 extra nights. So, had I been taking my family, it would have been a no-brainer. There's no way I would have done it on all sorts of counts. So, that was an interesting one because it showed me this issue about sacrifice. And we have to make it easy for people. Just another personal example. A friend of mine gave me a subscription for my birthday, gave me a subscription to Grind coffee pods in the UK. So this is an online coffee pod thing. They send them to you every month. They're fabulous. They're pink. They're beautifully designed. I can't recommend them highly enough. And you can put them in the compost and they decompose. I've tested this within 9 weeks reliably. Now, with a major coffee pod manufacturer I'm not going to name, those don't decompose. Now, you can send them back, but it's a hassle. Previously, we were filling up a green bag. Nobody ever bothered taking it to, not the post office, but somewhere else. So again, sacrifice was involved. And even in a well-intentioned family, we never got around to it. Grind solved the problem. So if effort, price, or food the kids don't like are all part of the sacrifice, we're not going there. The last one is that sustainability is becoming the new form of purpose. And we've talked and written extensively about purpose and its importance to brands over the last 2 to 3 years as we've seen its inexorable rise. I would suggest to you, and I suspect, given the audience, that a lot of people feel is sustainability is the purpose. But something else I've noticed, which I think is really interesting, is the rise of what I would call the triple native startup. So a lot of our clients have been visibly struggling, and we've been helping them at Accenture with digital natives over the last 10 years, maybe more than 10 years, actually. Companies which from the ground up are building with digital in mind because it's just second nature to them. But I've seen something else emerge recently, which is purpose native. I've had 2 really illuminating conversations, one of the startups I mentioned later on, who told me, their CEOs told them, founders told me that they actually sat, in one case almost in a dark room, for a few days, figuring out what's the purpose I want with my career, and then building out from that. And that led him, in fact, and the other one, to sustainability, which then becomes the third native thing. So for a lot of our enterprise clients, the challenge is you're going to be competing over the next 10 years with triple native companies. They've got digital and sustainability and purpose built in from the get-go. And I think that's going to be very important for us to begin to pivot around. So you may well be saying, okay, so what? How do we actually help? Now, this question, how do we help people fulfill their desire to make sustainable choices, I've put up deliberately because it's actually the wrong question. That's based on the thinking we had when we started thinking about this problem, because this statement is likely to appeal to that minority. So it'll always be, or at least for some time to come, a niche game. What it seeks to do is to close the say-do gap. But we need to close the vaguely back-of-mind to-do gap, which is a different order of problem. So actually, the question should be, just how do we help people consume more sustainably? That's actually the pivot we need to make. And that leads me on to the fourth major point that we want to make, which I'm going to expand on a fair bit because you probably want to hear some tangibles about what we should do, which is we've got to focus on reducing the burden. Think back over the videos that I've shown, the films I've shown, and the lives that people have and the way they're contextualizing sustainability in their lives. If we're going to be successful, we're going to have to reduce the burden. And this, of course, is a huge mission. This is actually, if you think back to the purpose point I just made, possibly the purpose that you need to embed at the heart of what you're trying to do with sustainability. And it's not about sustainable alternative. It's about mainstreaming sustainability by reducing the burden for people as we go. And there are three aspects to this. One is influence. One is what you offer. So influence, it's a key marketing and communication skill which many companies have perfected over decades. So we need to lean on that skill. The second is we need to build products and services and experiences. So actually what we put out in the market, the core of what you put out there has to change. And lastly, who and how you lead, how you engage with the world around you. So I'm going to drill into these a little bit more, and I'm going to provide with each one a question with each. So let's think about influence. So there's a lot of talk about information. And I saw this very clearly with the trip to Hamburg that I did, was I tried to find the information. It won't surprise you to know that neither EasyJet, nor British Airways, nor the German railway company, nor the French railway company, nor Eurotunnel, all of whom I had to go with, none of them publish carbon information at the point of purchase. So you have to go somewhere else. So I ended up going somewhere called EcoPassenger, which I can highly recommend to you. I'll come back to EcoPassenger in a moment, but they're very good, but it's hard to find the information. And the thing about information is it's not about increasing the way in which people grasp a complex issue. It's about reducing the burden of choice. And that's why we can do this in three ways. We can do it through intuition. So with intuition, many of you, I think, many of the people I speak to have read Daniel Kahneman's, I think now very famous book, Fast and Slow Thinking. In that, he talks about System 1 and System 2 as two primary modes of people's thought. System 1 is the very quick response in your head, which when I say what's 2 by 2, you know what it is. When I say to you, what's the capital of France, you know what it is. Those are actually Kahneman's examples. System 2 is what happens when you have something more difficult to grasp, like, why am I $1,000 overdrawn? So that's a harder problem to solve. You have to dive into your bank statements. You have to begin to think about it. Whereas, how much money do I have in my bank account? That's a System 1 problem. System 2 is when you have to begin to figure out how to travel to Hamburg by train, for example, and then it all gets a bit messy. So Kahneman's important because System 1 thinking, particularly when we're at the point of sale like she is, we need to be leaning on System 1 thinking, which is why for example, here, and we're showing a real-life example from Foundation Earth, what they're doing is really smart. Just show me what the measurement is here, because that's what I need to know, and then I can begin to make a decision around that. So are we making it intuitive for people at points where it matters? Obviously, if people are buying an electric vehicle, they may be putting in, but you can't rely on that, they may be putting in more time and consideration space into what they're buying. So maybe you can go to System 2 if they're making a really big £40,000 purchase. But if they're on System 1 in the supermarket, then we need to think in a different way. So then we need clarity. So yes, we can have that labeling, but what does good mean? We can't present stuff to people like they're climate scientists, which is actually what EcoPassenger did. I mean, I think EcoPassenger is great, so I applaud them, but I had to work quite hard to understand the stuff. And once it got beyond the carbon load that I was releasing by my journey, I began to struggle a bit. A good example of this, of clarity and providing people with clarity, or a good question to be asking, is the role that our customers think we should be playing, does that match our aspiration as an organization? So I talk a lot in other circumstances about brand permission space. I think there's a sustainability permission space here as well. Brand permission space is, for an example, I don't expect my bank to be able to tell me where a good restaurant is. It's not what banks do, so they shouldn't be providing me with restaurant services. But I do, I could imagine a bank keeping my data safe. They've just about got enough brand permission space to do something like that. In this space, I think what we're talking about is what's the expectation space? Actually, that's a better word. What's the expectation space for what you should fulfill on? So, another personal story. I have an electric vehicle, which I've had for 3 years. It's not, Tesla. It's another brand. It's a well-known global brand. And it's done what I wanted it to do largely. The trouble is, it's a small car. It's got very light alloy wheels deliberately to keep the weight down so that the battery life extends as long as it possibly can. I get that completely. Here's the problem. I live in a farming area in a rural part of southern England, and there are potholes everywhere, right outside my house in the lane. The wheels keep breaking. They're £330 a pop to replace. 2 went a month ago. I had to go into the garage and get them replaced. I don't like spending that amount of money on replacing wheels after only 2 or 3 years. But what gets even worse is when I sit there and I'm thinking about today and what I'm going to be talking about, and I said, what happens to the wheels when you take them away? He said, a lorry comes and takes them away every day, those and the tires. And then they get put in a landfill. So, I'm not going to name the brand, but nobody explained this to me. And of course, then it's systemically complicated because, we all know, I think most of us know, the difference between a car brand globally and the local dealer. They're split in two. So who's taking responsibility here exactly in that story? So clarity about what's going to happen, I think, is very important. And then the third one is context. So what's the point? I'm only one person. Does my contribution really matter? We need to help people understand, and I think we hear this question again and again. We need to help people understand why their contribution matters. So back to the Hamburg journey, it turned out that going by train, this is a bit I feel good about, cost basically 31 kilos of carbon. Going by plane would have cost 130, and going by non-electric vehicle would have been somewhere in the middle. So I feel good about that. But I haven't got anything to measure it against. It's just a number. 30, well, what do I do with that? I don't know what 30 kilos of carbon look like. And I guess most people don't. So then it's like, well, what do you do with that? So there are people beginning to come up with solutions. So Ecolytic, Duconomy, both great examples of companies that are saying, let's show consumers how they're performing against the average. Now, that's meaningful, because then I can begin to understand how I'm performing. Nest do this with their thermometers. If you have a Nest thermometer, it'll tell you every month how you're performing against other people like you in the area. And that actually provides a really simple, easy to read, totally technocratic way of helping people move forward. And we trialed this with our Glaswegians. We actually talked to them and we said, we looked at their shopping baskets, they allowed us to do so, and we said, let's compare you to the average shopping basket. And it shifted their attitudes palpably in the month when we were doing the research. And then, there's even more interestingly, you get on to the role of social media. So because they were engaged in the study, without us making it happen, their social media stuff started to surface sustainable issues to them. And they began to become more interested because the sustainable issues were there. And even at the sort of most basic level, one of our correspondents said memorably, I'd love it if Stacey Solomon, so most of you won't know Stacey Solomon is a UK celebrity. I've got to say, I didn't know either. I had to ask my 16-year-old daughter. She knew who she was. She is apparently a UK celebrity, but this Glaswegian said, if Stacey Solomon was talking about sustainability, I'd sit up and take notice. So there are some interesting things there, which, whether we like them or not, having to get celebrities involved, actually cut through and make a big difference. So the question on context is, do we make it easy for customers to triangulate their choices and the impact those have? So that's how do we influence. Then I said we'd talk about how do we change our offer. And I believe for a long time now that the inevitable impact of the sustainability debate is that we're going to have to at least think about and then probably act on the redesign of absolutely everything. I think there's a generation growing now, many of whom will be looking at everything, and we should be too, and saying, this table, this bottle, these scarves, have these been done in the right way? And should we redesign? And I think we are on the verge right now of having to, and should need to, at least think about redesigning absolutely everything. For the 26% who said, I've crossed the say-do gap, then they're explicitly there. They're buying Ecova washing up liquid. That's fine. But for the rest of us, we've got to embed sustainability in exactly the same way as we have already embedded safety or durability or other factors into the products we need to take to market. So there's plenty of need to systematize here. And there are three ways of doing that: through innovation, through value, and motivation. And I'll talk briefly about each one of these. So you could cynically say innovation got us here in the first place. Going back to the beginning of the Industrial Revolution, that was innovation and then some. And innovation has got us into this mess, and we actually need innovation to get us out of it. I think innovation has to be at the heart of this in terms of everything we do. But we have to innovate sustainability as a co-benefit. So it's not innovation for its own sake. It's innovation where sustainability is built in. We've done a huge piece of work recently with a major client globally where we've shown them and built a sustainable design kit for them where they can, everything they do that is new or anything where they're redesigning something that is old, they're building sustainability in as part of the design process. And I mean design as a big word, not just something designers do, but as something we all do if we're delivering new products and services into market. I think what IKEA, for example, are doing with their furniture buyback scheme is a great example of this. So you go into IKEA with an old piece of furniture from IKEA, and they give you vouchers to spend in store. Who loses? No one loses on this. It's a great way of looking at it. So, the line between, it delivers new service and revenue streams for IKEA, and the line between the responsibility of me and the responsibility of IKEA gets beautifully blurred. We're in it together, and they're helping me be in it together with them. We also need to think about innovation around the end of life for products as well. Check out what's happening with the tech is trash movement in the US. I think that's very interesting when it comes to technology, a subject close to Accenture's heart. But also look at the way in which the European Union has mandated, and I think quite rightly so, that we should just be standardizing around one kind of wire so we stop throwing things away. So innovation doesn't have to be about what's new, but we have to build sustainability into it. So the question here is, and I've touched on this already actually at length, but where's our responsibility end and where does a customer's responsibility begin? I think that's super important. My car wheel story demonstrates that well, and I think IKEA does as well. So the second thing I want to talk about here is under, the offer is value. So we can't compromise on value to the customer in favor of sustainability because then they're not going to buy, and that becomes a real problem. So examples of people who are not compromising. So Asda, for example, have greener Asda price, which means if you buy loose vegetables, then you're not going to pay any more, this is their guarantee to you, than you are if you buy prepackaged vegetables. And then lastly, I want to talk about beauty. So we don't talk about beauty enough, but beauty is really important. We need to make sustainability beautiful. We need the aesthetics to be wonderful because that helps people buy in as well. And a good example for this is Karun Eyewear. If you've not heard of them, I suggest you check them out. I think they're going to be here tomorrow, actually. Not here, but in Glasgow. Wonderful company who are basically recycling old fishing nets from the shores of Patagonia. Not the company Patagonia, but, in Chile, and around Tierra del Fuego, and are then turning those into glasses. You might think that's a minority sport. Not at all. They just this year won a distribution deal with Grand Vision, one of the largest retailers of glasses across Europe. So I think a great example of a company that's building beauty into what they do. So The question to ask here is, are we asking customers to sacrifice something to be sustainable? Because if we are, that may well be a problem. And then the third one is motivation. So motivation we've touched on already, but broadly speaking, the motivation might be self. We need to understand the motivation of customers at a really deep level. And in many ways, what I've been trying to communicate over the last almost 40 minutes now is getting deep and understanding customers is super critical because we need to understand their motivation. That motivation might be self, what's in it just for me. That motivation might be selfless, what's in it for people around me. Or it might be the social comparison that I've talked about already. You know, show me what Stacey Solomon is doing. Show me what other people like me are doing in the area. And our research basically has revealed the rich tapestry of motivations, and for every product and service, and this is where it gets complicated, probably for every geography, we need to get our hands all over this. So, the last one to talk about is engage. I've talked about this is really an all-company thing, and this is not, I think, a new message at COP. We're going to hear it a lot, but this requires organizational change and a completely different mentality. In a way, it seems to me that there's a mirror here between the organization and the individual, which is organizations have to build sustainability into what they do, but not sacrifice the other kinds of value that they also deliver. You know, full employment, value to shareholders, et cetera, et cetera. Now, we are shifting our notion of what value is, but organizations have the same problem as the people we're talking about, which is that they're trying to fit this into their lives where they have other priorities as well. So COVID has actually increased our need to really get under the skin of the customer, and what we know from COVID, because we've studied this closely, is that they have reimagined their priorities big time over the last 2 years. So if you're not up to speed with where your customer has gone over the last 2 years, you need to be, because they are shifting their thinking very rapidly. So I was probably a bit pessimistic earlier on about sustainability, mass market being a myth, but the tide is moving in this direction, even if it's maybe moving a little slower than we would like. Now, in order to understand, I want you to think about data in 3 ways. We typically think about big data. We now need to think about big data and how it works to understand sustainability. What you may not have heard before is the terminology thick data. So thick data, that's the deep data, that's what I've just been presenting to you over the last 40 minutes, is thick data about the texture of people's lives. And then we need to talk about broad data. What are the trends that are happening out there? What are the things that may or may not? Will metaverse affect this in one way or another? So those 3 data, big data, thick data, and broad data, we need those in order to really understand. The second is we need to collaborate. Sorry, let me move on because I've said that already. So we need to find new ways to collaborate. Now, obviously, you're going to hear the word collaboration a lot at COP26 and afterwards, and everyone's talking about how do we get companies to collaborate together, and I heard a great session earlier on which was all about collaboration around smart cities. The point I just want to land here is you've got to collaborate through the customer lens. So, understandably, we get very focused on industries, either where we work or as consultants, the industries we serve, et cetera, et cetera. But customers don't see that as rapidly as we do. You know, I'm having a COP26 experience these 2 days. That involves travel, that involves hospitality, it involves fashion, because I thought about what I was going to wear. It involves a whole host of things which cross boundaries. In my head, I don't think, oh, I'm having a hospitality experience when I walk into the hotel. I'm just having my COP26 experience, and that's what my family see on the WhatsApp feed. So we've got to look at collaboration from the customer perspective. I think that's really important. 3 things to think about there. One is the metrics. So Foundation Earth, they've got Co-op, M&S, and Sainsbury's to collaborate together on that signaling on packaging that I talked about earlier. The second is design. Pulpex is a new kind of packaging being driven by Pepsi, Unilever, Diageo. Who would have seen that coming? Packaging, that as a customer I can understand. And thirdly, information. I talked about Duconomy earlier on. They're partnering with MasterCard in order to bring your carbon footprint information to you across a range of things that you do. Again, I don't think, oh, that's a financial services company. That looks to me like information about my carbon footprint, which I value. So the last is lead. And this is about engaging, and is actually what we're doing here. It's about proactive legislative pressure, and I believe that companies need to step into this space on behalf of the customer, because they're not going to break the stalemate, we're going to break the stalemate, and actually play a leading position in doing so. So, there were 4 points that I wanted to talk about today. I want to talk about our need to break the stalemate. That mass, at least for the time coming, is a myth, and we need to accept that and work with it. That behaviour change is not as simple as it sounds. It's necessary, but we have to frame it exquisitely carefully. And that the key to doing that is to reduce the burden for people. This, I believe, is the role that companies have. And this, when we're thinking about the human at the end of all of this, this is what we need to be doing with them and for them and on their behalf. So I'm going to finish with one last film, if we can roll the film, please, which shows the people who we worked with in the summer, which shows them talking directly to you about their expectations of enterprise. So if we can have the film, please.
You put in a lot of effort to be like sustainable, to be like carbon neutral, and it's just, everybody does it, but I feel like it doesn't make any difference, because there's still going to be like, I don't know, tyre incineration factories or whatever.
I don't think the companies do care as much as they maybe should.
Big business is often forced to make changes rather than getting on the front foot.
I think they should be putting more into it. They're selling this stuff, so they should be putting more into the environment, especially the ones that are making the plastic crap stuff, you know what I mean?
To be more sustainable, we're being guilt-tripped into spending more and more money on sustainable products.
I think we've all got a part to play in it, and I do definitely think that companies that are delivering do also have a part to play in it.
The waste that I produce in my life is minuscule in comparison to, and I think I do make sustainable choices. Like, I do use reusable products, but I'm still like a tiny, tiny amount in comparison to these corporations.
I would like to know that all of my electricity comes from renewables. I want to know that my heating comes from renewables. I want to know that my house is properly made so that I'm not letting out energy that I don't need.
I would take them, the CEOs of the companies, get them all together and take them on a wee expedition.
It'd be nice just to see some, as I would say, stepping up and really leading with this is why we're doing stuff.
Take them to the coral reefs. I would do that. I'd go right round the whole of the British Isle. I think somebody's already doing that.
Aye. Big supermarket chains, they're not short of a few pence, do you know what I mean? But obviously the corporate machine is obviously just going to keep turning, and they're going to become hungry for more and more money. That's what businesses do. Businesses generate money.
Corporations are going to be the ones who possibly make our world uninhabitable.
Instead of putting an advert on the telly, put something about what's happening with the climate and how we can help. Just advertise. If there's no advertisement anywhere, they'll not know. My dad doesn't know a lot.
I know you about that.
He doesn't know about anything.
Money and greed is not what makes the world go round, you know. I think it maybe boils down to that. The world needs a change. Not for me, but for my children, and for their children, and their children's children.
So, Hannah, Mark, Sean, Stephen, Nabila, Jimmy and Linda, Blair, they're the humans at the heart of the challenge. So I want to thank them for coming into the hall and talking to us today. Thank you very much. So now we've got a panel to discuss what we've just seen and beyond, and I'm delighted to invite Alexandra from H&M and Zahra from Salesforce up on stage. And we've also got, hopefully joining us, Chris. Yes, Chris, you're there. Hi there. Chris, I'm sorry you couldn't make it. I think there's COVID in the family.
Yes, unfortunately there is, so sorry I can't be there in person, but hopefully saving everyone else some trouble in the meantime, and some carbon.
Very good of you, and thank you. Would you like to come up on stage, Zahra and Alexandra? Thank you.
Hello, Chris. Nice to see you again. Can you hear me?
Hi, Zahra.
Hey.
I can.
So, Chris, as you're not here, let's start with you. Would you like to introduce yourself and your role at OVO?
Sure, thanks, Mark. So, hi all. My name's Chris Russell. I'm Managing Director of OVO Drive at OVO Energy. So that's effectively, I look after everything electric vehicles, and very pleased to hear, Mark, that you're already on the journey despite the wheel problem. And just more broadly, my background, I've been in the energy and utility sector for the last 12 years.
Thank you. Zahra, do you want to introduce yourself?
Thank you, Mark. Hello, I'm Zahra Bahrololoumi. I am the CEO of Salesforce UK and Ireland. I started that role in March, and I must say it feels like coming home today, because for 22 years prior to that, hello, Peter. For 22 years prior to that, I worked at Accenture. So thrilled to be here.
Lovely to have you here. Alexandra.
Thank you. Nice to be here. Hi, I'm Alexandra Razola. I work as Head of Circular Business Model Incubation at the H&M Group, so working with innovation and circularity for H&M. And I've spent my entire career on human-centered design. So I'm very excited to be here today.
Subject close to my heart. Alexandra, why don't we start with you? So I just wondered if you had any observations about what we just talked about and about the films we saw.
Yes. First, I just want to say thank you for sharing, and thank you to the participants for sharing their perspectives and letting us come into their reality and the struggles that we have, and that the struggles that everyone has in their everyday life.
Yes. Everyday life is, I mean, that's the point, is it's not as clean cut as we sometimes think it is when we look at it from afar and we're trying to come up with strategies. Zahra.
Well, firstly, congratulations. I think they were beautiful videos, and I think what I take away from that is, you know, we all talk about sustainability, we all talk about pandemic, post-pandemic, life after pandemic, but what you've achieved with these videos is you've made something very human, very real. You've taken, you know, when I think about economic disruption, actually on the ground and in everybody's real lives, it's just struggling to survive and make, you know, the right economic choices, and I thought it was incredibly powerful. Thank you.
Good, thank you. Chris.
Oh dear, this is home broadband challenges. Yeah, lots of that resonated with me, Mark. I think in particular, the word that was used a number of times was convenience, or as you put it, kind of the reduction of burden. And I think that's really something we see every day in the energy sector. You know, utilities aren't things that people enjoy paying. So actually working out how we can engage with consumers in the best way to actually reduce the decision fatigue, if you like, that they have in their day-to-day lives. And I think the second point, which is really important as well, is around making positive influences rather than negative. So to point around sort of shaming people into you've made the wrong decision, I think it's our responsibility to make sure that's a really easy choice, and actually that's set within a broader context of education that you've talked about as well. So really enjoyed those. Thank you.
Could I pick up with you, Chris, on that? So can you tell us a bit about what you're doing at OVO? Because I think the EV journey is something it's quite easy for people to relate to because they begin to think about the changes they need to make. So what are the things that you're doing to reduce the burden of the EV journey?
So point around journey, you know, we talk a lot about kind of educate, enable, and then engage. So I think Attenborough was mentioned on one of the videos very helpfully. That makes the point really nicely that there is a journey that most consumers are going on, and we talked about a number of frictions within that. If you apply that to the EV journey, as you mentioned, there's a really important one there where actually a number of people across the UK now, as a result of various subsidies and education that they've had, are making that decision. What we shouldn't assume is that people can make the decision about the car and the sustainability choice in wholeheartedness. So what we really have to make sure we can do is say, you know, step one is you've made your decision in an electric vehicle. Step 2 and 3 is going to be much more about how you use that vehicle day to day. How do you charge it? What's the most sustainable time to charge it, and actually the most convenient time? And actually, how does that align to price? So everything we focused on at OVO is saying actually all of those things need to line up nicely. As an example, we've launched a proposition recently called Anytime, where a consumer can come home in the evening, they can plug their car in, and it said to us, I need my car at 7 o'clock tomorrow morning. So when you charge that vehicle is entirely up to you. And then it's our job in the background to make sure that's done at the lowest carbon intensity period for the grid. And that also happens to be the cheapest period for the grid. But from a consumer perspective, it's easy. It's the lowest price. We do all the hard stuff and they just go in and have their dinner and don't think about it. So making sure that kind of that hassle, the absence of friction is built into every single proposition that we do is our job.
Thank you, Chris. That's super, and exactly the example I wanted, because I think there's an interesting challenge for you, Alexandra, which is so different, because you're asking people to do something different with the circular model, which, again, actually, like Chris, people haven't done before. So what are the ways in which you're tackling that?
Well, I think, and just also from the reflections of the movies, is to really empathize with customers and consumers and understand, their needs and their drivers and their circumstances in order to be able to create services and products that they want to use. And I think, we know that people have a need to live and express and develop their style, and that goes on all the time. But we need to find new ways in order to, put fashion and style where customers are. That doesn't contribute to a throwaway attitude. So I think really taking the human perspective in understanding why and where and how will be key for us moving forward.
And how are you going about that?
Well, I mean, we're doing a lot of explorations in different circular business models. So I'm looking a lot into re-commerce and rental, and we're investing a lot in that space. And I think, H&M being a global player, we have a big reach, and we have a lot of customers that we can reach with these services. But it needs to be integrated into the core of our business. It can't be something that's just on the side. Because I think what we see, and I think the example with the steaks was so great from the movies, when it's something that's it's not where consumers are, we're asking them to do more, than maybe what's convenient for them. So we need to find ways of integrating this into the core of our business.
And do you find, how easy is it for you getting collaboration going across H&M? Because you're in a system, and
Yes.
this is going to involve behaviour change in the organisation as well as a customer behaviour change.
Absolutely, yes. And I think, the way we're tackling this is basically looking through the lens of our entire value chain. We need to work with innovation in all parts of the value chain. So starting from design, how we work with designing our products, how we work with, material innovation, how we work with production and our entire supply chain. But we also need to understand the customer experience, And the way that we're tackling it is, taking a holistic approach to enable a systemic change, because it can't be siloed. And that's difficult in a massive organization, But I think one of the foundations that we have within our company is collaboration and working across different boundaries, because this will require everyone to step up.
Yeah.
It can't just be the people within my team. This is something that will impact our entire business.
Zahra, so Salesforce,
Yes.
different kind of organisation,
Yes.
not directly consumer-facing, but it seems to me, because your role is to act as an interface between customer and brand, provide the technology behind that. And we saw some of the things on the film. I framed some of them basically physical in supermarkets, but of course a lot is now digital. How are you thinking about how you provide that information to customers and the role that Salesforce plays in creating the behaviour change we talked about?
And especially to the masses, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, that's a really good question. I think just a further reflection in order to answer that question, the debate around climate change, I think, is well established, and I think people do feel like they need to, it's real, we're in code red, they want to do it, and yet they're, consumers are burdened, and all of the brilliant, eloquent ways that you described this, much better than I did, I can. From a Salesforce perspective, we have our own story, which has been grounded in Mark Benioff and his values and our journey, our sustainability journey, which I can talk at depth about. But from a consumer perspective, we drive change through to your point, to the interactions we have with our customers, and we work with our customer base, our big companies and small companies, and it's really through them that we reach the consumers and we drive that change, and we do that in a number of ways. I think if if the pandemic has taught Salesforce anything, and 2020 being a poignant year, it's been that the role of technology and sustainability and how they go hand in hand, and how that role of technology can accelerate the reach to the masses. So as an example, we have acquired Slack. Slack, we have shown or seen, certainly within the context of the Salesforce example, that it's driven sustainable innovation at speed. We as an organisation, our customers that use it are solving problems 3 times faster. So when you think about that in the context of problems or issues relating to sustainability or reach of customers, then you can see that acceleration.
Yes.
The second point I would say is through education.
So just to be clear, so that's technology as a way of speeding up, because speed is essential right now.
Exactly that, right?
Okay.
And then the role of education and its reach to the masses. We have a free online platform called Trailhead. Some of you will have engaged with it. We've got, sustainability training on that. It's free and available to individuals so that they can understand the choices they need to make and the behaviours that they need to adopt. And I think I come back to the technology point because I can see how it is transformative. This morning, Mark, and this is not a Salesforce point, but it's to illustrate that point around technology, I had the pleasure of having breakfast with the 5 Earthshot winners this morning. And I have to say, every time I meet individuals like that, I always think, what the hell have I done with my life? Because they are just so brilliant. But their challenge now is one of scale.
Yeah.
Their challenge is one of scale. And how do they accelerate the brilliant products and services that they have created? And so when you think about, and now I bring it back to Salesforce, when you think about our role is to connect consumers and companies. And companies create these brilliant products and offerings and want to get it to market beautifully. And our role with our technology enhances that engagement. We have brilliant tool sets that can communicate or allows customers to communicate with their customers and amplify that engagement message. I just remembered one thing. You talked about your car that you purchased from a very well-known manufacturer that we won't mention. Had a certain product suite from Salesforce been engaged within that customer, and they are a customer of ours as well, or a client of ours, then actually you would have received lots of communication tuned to you, clearly personalised, and really enhanced your relationship with your vehicle from a sustainability lens in a way that I think would have...
It's great you say that, actually, because one of my complaints about it at the time, when I bought the car originally 3 years ago, was that nobody ever said to me, well done for buying an electric vehicle. Not once. Not the dealer, not the brand, not anything. And it's just such a marketing and communications mess. Because that would have spoken to my need to feel like I was doing something. So it's very interesting. Wow, the Earthshot winners, that's really amazing.
They are incredibly powerful.
Yeah, I bet.
And actually, there was one of the video, I can't remember who said it, about the coral,
That was Linda. Yeah, about the coral reefs.
Well, one of the Earthshot winners
is working on that.
Yeah.
It's funny, the Earthshot thing, because for those of you who aren't aware, this is a thing that Prince William organised with prizes of £1 million, I think.
£1 million for each of them.
For each of them, and was on TV in Britain about a month ago. And I watched it on a Sunday night, and I found myself getting a bit irritated that the whole thing was being framed with Coldplay and lots of celebrities and actors, and I just felt like, why do we need them? And I was moaning about it the next day to somebody on the team, and she said, but Mark, that's what the say-do thing is all about. That was the story I was trying to tell about if we put people in there that people will listen to. It doesn't matter. What matters is that they hear the message, and I thought that was really, really interesting.
I'm just on a roll now. The other comment, and it was the father-daughter, was it Linda?
Yes.
Father-daughter, I just want some advertising. Just tell me, you've got to tell me. And I think we were having a conversation. Am I allowed to talk about the government, my ask of the government?
Yeah, go for it.
So, I think Linda had a really valid point, and of course businesses have a role in communicating their offering, and of course Salesforce can help with that. But I also want to see propaganda-like levels of communication from the government. And for anybody that's old enough to remember, if I say the strapline to you, don't die of ignorance, what does that make you think? AIDS. Right? So 1986, propaganda-like levels of communication around HIV, really informative leaflet drops. We've got much more sophisticated methods now. But we were all educated en masse and were able to make choices. I was a child, but, adults could make choices. With COVID, we saw, hands, face, space. And we were educated. And I think that's what people are crying out for, just, non-emotionally loaded, from a guilt perspective, simple communication around choices they need to make.
Yes. I think, so I'm going to link it back to you, Chris, because I think certainly in the UK, the government action of mandating that no new internal combustion engine cars can be sold from 2030 is interesting and opens the door for you. How do you then build off that by building trust and brand permission space? Why should I trust OVO more than any other supplier?
That's a great question. So I think just touching on the 2030 ban, I think that's a really interesting point, because I was recently asked, do I think that's too far out? Or actually, could we have been more aggressive? I think the really important point there is actually by setting that deadline, it's created a very clear line in the sand ahead of which car companies have to evolve, and they have to update their offering and engage appropriately themselves. So what it's really done, I think, is put a very clear marker down to say this is the direction of travel. So at some point, choice is not going to be there from a consumer perspective, but it has to be led by organisations, which I think is really important. To your question on sort of brand right and kind of ability to have that conversation, I think this really comes down to, it was raised in the point, raised in the video about people being able to go on that journey and make that step. So we've just talked about education. The engagement step for me is the next bit. So making it clear at the point of someone trying to have that, you make that decision that actually the business case is solid. And I hate to use kind of business language when you say business case, but if you turn it into electric vehicle buying decisions, and then equally for heat, for electrification of heat in the home, which is another major carbon driver for UK households. Right now, it is expensive compared to just picking up something else secondhand. So everything that we're doing is focused really on trying to solve for what we see as kind of the four sort of hassle factors or hurdles. So the first of which is financial. So how can OVO help an OVO customer or a new customer that wants to join OVO get into an electric vehicle more easily? And we can do that in a few different ways by working with finance partners to smooth the cost of the capital up front, link it into your energy accounts so that you're getting discounts on your property, give the confidence that actually the energy that's going into the vehicle is also renewable, potentially at no additional cost, depending on how we structure that. So we're trying to remove that kind of financial barrier, which they may not be able to get elsewhere if they're just buying that through their local dealership. So that's point one. The second one is working closely with the government, automotive manufacturers themselves around the incentive. And actually, if you take that from a government perspective, a really good example, and I'm not saying this is the perfect mechanism by any means, but a good example was solar uptake over the last 20 years. The UK, if you speak to colleagues in different countries, that they often kind of laugh at the fact that the UK's got reasonable density of solar because we're not famous for our sun. But actually, the incentive that was introduced around enabling households to invest with a clear view that actually that was a good way of spending their money, and actually they would get a return on that, or at least the absence of another cost, really sparks a burst of solar installation. So working with governments and OEMs around how we can do something similar for electric vehicles and also heat is really important. And then the third one is hassle. So there was a couple of comments in the videos around this, probably more relevant in particular on electrification of heat. But if anyone that's tried to do this themselves will know, it's not the simplest thing to do. If you live in an old property, you've got to make sure it's insulated well. You've probably got to think about pipe work, radiator sizes, potentially ripping up floors. It's not as simple as saying I've switched to a renewable electricity tariff. It's much harder. So finding ways, again, working with different partners. Can we enable customers that are going through that journey to stay somewhere else for a period of 2 weeks? Can we time it with a retrofit? Actually, can that link to a green remortgage process that you go through? So how can we solve 3 or 4 different problems? And I think where OVO's scale, backed behind our Plan Zero mission, we have that breadth of partners and that engagement with regulatory bodies and government to actually put in place something that's really genuinely scalable. There was a great comment by the father-daughter combo again that I think her statement was, I'm just a tiny part of this. OVO has 5 million customers across the UK, across the entirety of it. So we have scale. If we can build propositions that actually solve some of those problems, then actually we have the remit and the opportunity to really be part of that transformation.
I thought your example there, Chris, of actually going so far as to look at how you can provide alternative accommodation for people for 2 weeks while their pipes are ripped up is a superb example of going the extra mile to reduce the burden. Really, really interesting. Thank you for that. So on switching back to clothing, so different context, same subject overall. How, when we did, as you know, we've done research in Sweden similar to the research we've done here. And one of the things that we heard, because we focused on retail, was, but retail is inherently unsustainable, but I can't give up shopping. So how can you shift, because you're just one of the best known retail brands in the world. My kids get really excited when I say I'm doing phone calls with H&M. What can you do to shift that brand perception into a space where customers are going to give you permission to do the things that you talked about earlier? Because it seems to be an interesting challenge, to say the least.
Absolutely, yes, that is a challenge. I think, when it comes to fashion and sustainability, when we also look at, and I just want to point out that as well, and I know the research that was done in Sweden is really interesting, but also when we look at a global level, we see that it's so different that how consumers think about sustainability when it comes to these things. And in Sweden, it's quite a mature market for these topics. But it's also interesting to look at that then, because then how can we take the customers along for the ride, And I think it's all about providing options to customers and being transparent. Mm-hmm. And we look also at, coming back to collaboration, how can we work on an industry level to collaborate on creating that transparency? And I think the HIG Index is a good example of how we're working across industries to share, data and making customers aware of the choices that they're making. But one thing that we see is that it's still, even though those are great initiatives and it's fantastic and we're definitely moving in the right direction, it's still very difficult to understand, and it's difficult to understand the impact and what that actually means. So I think what we're trying to do is to really create options that are just like any other products, and that goes back to through the whole value chain, but also the end-of-life services that we can provide. How can we keep garments in the loop for longer? And how can we as a brand take that position? Because we're a big player, so we have both the means and the responsibility to drive the shift in this market.
I really love the observation that a lot of this is about collaboration across the value chain with other organizations as well, because typically, let's face it, the construct of, consumer marketing has always been you think about your brand on its own, or almost always. And actually what you're saying is if we're going to change brand permission space, we actually need to think about our brand in collaboration with others. That seems to me to be a radical reset with the way in which we think about marketing, design, communications, etc. So I think that's a really, really interesting point.
Yeah.
Zahra, back to you. Have you got good examples of brands you're working with who are beginning to shift their permission space, build trust in this space, etc.?
We've got many, but actually, given Chris is here from let's talk about energy for a second. I'll zoom in on that, and I think
I wanted you to.
Okay, all right. Sorry, Chris. Chris and I used to work together a long time ago, so it's nice to see him. I think actually, Alexandra, one thing you just said, you're big, you've got the means, and people are expecting it of you, and I think that features very heavily in many organisations that we talk to. And I did want to actually touch upon SMEs in a moment. But as to an example of organisations we're working with, and going back to the trust point, and I think there has been a crisis of trust, and I think obviously OVO's leading the way here, but the energy sector has with the rising wholesale gas prices, we're seeing organisations going bust. People are trying to make the right choices and balancing costs. So there is a crisis of trust, I think, in this space. But one organisation we're working with that I think is really leading the way, And it's a bit of an anomaly because they're seen as a behemoth, but they're so progressive, is Engie.
Engie, the French utility.
Engie, the French utility organisation. And actually, you know, picking on something you just said around, you know, the transparency, they are really wanting to accelerate the shift to zero carbon solutions. And they're being very overt about that, and they're really trying to educate their customer base with that. And I think they're taking a very human and technology kind of led approach in terms of unifying their customer data and trying to create new business models so that they can provide zero carbon solutions as a service. And what they're doing is they're providing an extraordinary level of transparency and data to customers about their usage so that they feel that they're informing customers and guiding them to switch solutions. And I think they are a great example of, you know, acknowledging their role in society, acknowledging the trust challenge, and then utilising through, you know, superior engagement and connection, as well as powerful technology solutions with data at the heart of it, to really drive that change. So I really admire what they're doing, and I think, you know, they're leading the way.
And who's designing? You may not know, but who's designing? Sorry for those who are watching by video. Glasgow may be cold, but there are still flies here.
I know, there are so many flies. I'm worried I'm going to eat one.
I've had the same problem. So I talked a bit about the information challenge and about the challenge of making it clear. So you can provide me with lots of data, but how are you going about, or how are Engie going about providing clarity to the data so that I understand its meaning and myself in the context of that?
Well, I mean, without going into too much detail, I think it's about how do you frame information in a simplistic way that connects emotionally to the core of an individual and makes a choice easy. I think that's probably the simplest way to frame it, and that's how the message is being communicated.
So that is being thought about?
It is being thought about. So I think I'd love you to see it. In fact, maybe you can show it to you. Sorry, this fly really likes me. Maybe that's a hint.
Can I just pick up on something
you
mentioned there? Because I think it's so interesting, and I think what we see from our research is that, you know, a lot of the times consumers default to things that are close to home, right? You know, and they default to things like, oh, but this is being sent through this transport system. That can't be good for the environment because that's so close to home, right? It's something you can understand because maybe you drive yourself or you go somewhere. And I think it's the same when it comes to food. It's quite easy to relate to.
Yes.
But when we're talking about carbon emissions, you know, sometimes it's so abstract.
Yes.
And it'll be so important for us to try to make it tangible. You know, what does this mean? What does this actual energy saving mean for you? And how can we understand what resonates with what customers? Because that will be different.
I think that's a marvellous point. And it's worth everyone thinking about that is, I talk about this a lot, but what's the mental model that the customer or the consumer has? And some things it's easy to have mental models over. Like, I can see these beans come from Tanzania. Is that a good idea or is it not? And I understand. I can roughly work out what that chain is. But you're right, with other more complex things like carbonists, I don't get that. I don't have a mental model for it. And therefore, I can't engage with it. And unless people have a mental model, they can't engage.
Exactly.
So Chris, I'm going to come back to you because I can see on the time we've got 2 minutes left. So maybe just a statement from each of you about what you think is next for your organisation. What are the things that you're working on next that you need to create breakthrough on over the next year?
Great, thanks. So probably two different parts to it. So the phrase "stepping up" was on the one of the videos, which I thought was great. So I think there's certainly an internal progress towards our own Plan Zero goal. So as an example, electrifying all of our fleet. But then more externally, the point I just want to make is the uptake of electric vehicles is that great use case that you mentioned of there's a primary and a secondary benefit. So the driver can save money and save carbon by switching to electric vehicles, but then also there's the potential to then charge that in a smarter way that helps decarbonise the grid and potentially even supply energy back from the vehicle to the grid in what we call V2G. So we're very much focused on how we can use the vehicle really as a turning point in people's journey towards a genuine kind of Plan Zero lifestyle. And we do that using data with things like our Greenlight platform. So those are key next steps for us.
Vehicle as pivot in people's heads. Vehicle is a place where people pivot in their heads.
Exactly. So for a lot of people, certainly the early kind of adopters of electric vehicles, this has become a bit of a turning point where previously people don't know what a kilowatt hour is. They might have seen it on the electricity bill and not really cared about it, not really thought about where that electricity has come from, and not really have any insight into what the rest of the home is doing. So we see this kind of focusing on the vehicle and then a kind of halo effect building within our customers' minds, and that's a really important transformation moment in our journey.
Makes a great deal of sense. Thank you, Chris. Alexandra, what's next for you and the circular business?
Yes, I mean, H&M Group has an ambition to become climate positive by 2040 and circular. 2040, yes. Climate positive. And circular business models will be one of the important levers to pull in order to reach that goal. And I think our ability to deliver on that ambition is really what's going to determine our ability to grow and attract customers and future talent. So it will be super important for us to.
That's also a very important point I'm glad you raised. I think one of the things that we haven't talked about today, but that if we actually get things right in this, then it becomes a magnet for the kind of talent that we need.
Yes.
For sure.
Yeah.
Because, our employees are people as much as the customers and consumers are, for sure. In fact, they're one and the same.
Yeah.
Zahra, Salesforce.
So Salesforce is actually fully net zero now. So we're really proud of that achievement, and it's been a long and challenging journey, but we are net zero across our full value chain, and we operate with 100% renewable energy across our full operation. And we're also a huge contributor to the 1 trillion trees movement with the WEF. So we're well on our journey, but there's still a lot to do. And I think, to answer your point around what's next, I think there's two things really that come to mind. One is alleviating the burden for our own customers. And actually, we are doing that through the use of our product called Sustainability Cloud, which was something that's been demand-led. We never intended to productize this, but it accelerated our own sustainability journey and our path to net zero. And actually, we're seeing more and more demand for it because we can provide, full transparency of an environmental footprint for an organisation. It's, investor grade, customizable ESG data that can really help with filings and audits, as well as being able to, most importantly, to be able to act and respond. So we're really, really working with a number of organisations around, the Sustainability Cloud, including Accenture. So Accenture is a huge partner with us on that. And the last point, I come back to my SMEs, right? So H&M have the scale and the responsibility. Salesforce has the scale, Accenture has the scale. But we've got to remember that our economy is made up of hundreds of thousands of SMEs, small and medium enterprises, who are really struggling. They can barely survive themselves, particularly post-pandemic. And actually, they don't have the luxury of a sustainability officer. They don't have the luxury even of a marketing officer. So from a Salesforce perspective, it's really important to us that we amplify our impact. And in doing so, we've actually captured our journey and our learnings through what we've called a climate action report. So we've created that around 6 key themes, around carbon reduction, removal, the trillion trees and restoration, education, innovation, and advocacy. So we've created that so that we can enable and educate and help the broader SME base to accelerate their own journey. So for us, it's about removing the burden with the tech, as well as amplifying that message to help those that don't have the luxury that we have as large organisations.
I'm glad you brought SMEs into the room. I think that's such a good point, and probably largely not so visible here, except for the triple native startups that we talked about earlier. Yes. Okay, so that's all we have time for today. Chris, thank you very much. Alexandra, Zahra, thank you. I also want to thank the absolutely fantastic team who did the research and created those films, because I think they've done an unbelievable job, and I had the unbelievably lucky gift of just standing up and telling you what they told me. So thank you very much, everyone. Thank you for everyone who's been online.